Hey everyone, this is Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're talking about Watch Dogs. This is the official review. I've already spoken about the PC performance on multiple video cards. We've talked about mouse smoothing, we've talked about crash fixes, we've talked about PC optimization, and all of these things happened because Watch Dogs, in short, has been somewhat of a disaster in terms of its release on the PC as a platform. So that gives you a bit of a spoiler as to what I think in this review. The review will contain discussion on hardware optimization. It will go into bugs I've experienced, me doing Ubisoft's QA job for them, talking about fundamental design issues, unintuitive input dooming the game to user abandonment, and then the conclusion. So quite a bit of stuff to go over here today, and it's all stemming from one single factor, and that is that this game has been hyped to oblivion and back, and it's completely unable to achieve any of the expectations set by that hype. So that is a fault of the industry and of the consumers, but it's not necessarily something we'll dive into too deeply here in this review. So that's a lot of topics. Let's start with the hardware, since that is the easiest to discuss. Putting it short, Watch Dogs is the most horribly optimized PC game I have ever had the misfortune of playing in recent years. Titanfall was pretty damn bad. Watch Dogs is entirely new levels of bad. It was, I achieved all of 53 FPS on average when using a 780 Ti in combination with the 4770K and lots of RAM. That was at a very high speed, and the performance is detrimental for several reasons. First of all, Ubisoft has failed to optimize their game for computer hardware in general. I'm sure it runs more acceptably on consoles, but on PC it is totally unacceptable to have 53 FPS with almost max settings on a 780 Ti, which is a $720 video card that has 2,880 cores. It's got 5 teraflops of raw compute power, a 3 gigabyte frame buffer. I mean, the thing has a memory bandwidth of 336 gigabytes per second, so we know we're capable of filling that frame buffer if necessary, and yet the game performs horribly on it. So why is that? Well, after some research, it looks like a lot of it is it's twofold. One part is anti-aliasing. For some reason, anti-aliasing is a massive hit to performance in Watch Dogs, more so than I've seen in any other game I've ever benchmarked. And that's an issue on Ubisoft's part, failing to optimize it and probably build anti-aliasing properly into the game. And this is evidenced by the fact that jumping between MSAA4X and TSMA produces almost a 2x FPS increase, whereas dropping from ultra settings to medium is about a 10 FPS increase on the 780 Ti. So the only reason we see a big increase on the 780 Ti when changing settings is when changing anti-aliasing. Further, when testing with a 7870 or 270X or a similar architecture card, that's basically the same video card with the R series branding, I get frame freezes. These are actual freezes, several seconds long. We get stuttering, we get frame drops. I got frame drops and micro stuttering that was quite severe when using SLI and trying to use Crossfire. It was actually I determined advisable to disable both of those and use a single GPU because it was so bad. And that's kind of frustrating as a PC user. So this all happens because of optimization, and it happens regardless of your video card drivers. In fact, updating to AMD's new drivers produces about a 10% FPS improvement, and you have to update because if you don't, you're going to get a blue screen of death when playing the game on 14.4 with certain AMD cards. So it's a bit of a mess. I thought the CPU might be the throttle, but changing from a 3570K to a 4770K saw almost no improvement in performance. That was noteworthy. It was about half a frame per second, which is within margin of error. And the game overall is pretty underwhelming in terms of graphics. It looks great, don't get me wrong, but it is not this generation's Crysis. It is not something that pushes the 780 Ti to its limits. So we've got some kind of issue in the software that's bottlenecking the hardware, not the other way around. But moving on from the hardware stuff, because I know a lot of you aren't necessarily as interested in that, we have plenty of other wonderful experiences with Watch Dogs that I've gone through in the last week, and a lot of it calls back to my experience working as a test engineer at Dell and at other companies doing QA. So the reason I mention this is because I've done Ubisoft a huge favor and have classified several issues as Severity 1 or Severity 2 in my full article that's linked in the description below. And just kind of skimming over some of these issues that ruin the game experience entirely as a gamer, we had, I experienced 3 different scenarios when CTDs crash to desktop would happen regularly. One was with UPlay online mode simply being enabled, so if you wanted to use UPlay, which that makes you a rarity in and of itself, if you actually wanted to use UPlay and you had online mode enabled, it would occasionally and sporadically crash the desktop. Another issue stemmed from, actually it was just completely random. I think it was a memory leak potentially, where the game would just crash after some time of playing. Another issue was a sporadic audio loop that caused a crash to desktop. I was unsure of which audio file triggered this. I also got blue screens of death, which is 100% inexcusable in software. It's not in the slightest bit allowed in terms of when I play a game. If I get a blue screen of death, I am instantly condemning that game for all manner of reasons. And that's because if a BSOD occurs, first of all, you're not just losing game data. Now you are threatening the user's environment, in that if the OS is performing some kind of write, depending on the OS, you could potentially be compromising the OS and its stability upon reboot. You can also be compromising the integrity of an SSD if it's performing some kind of garbage collection or write function, because SSDs don't like being shut down randomly when they're performing these functions, and neither do hard drives. And then we've got the issue of background applications. If I have a Word document open, or if I have a certain tab open in the background and it's not saved, and I get a blue screen of death from this game, I've suddenly lost that data. And so the list goes on, and it's problematic, and frankly, I hope that other game companies can learn from this, because in my eyes, it is inexcusable for a game company to put this sort of software out on the market. And this doesn't even get into NAT negotiation failures. It doesn't get into Uplay's servers being unable to handle the load of their overhyped game. It doesn't talk about servers failing to synchronize cloud data between multiple PCs, or even on the same PC when forced to play using local settings due to the server downtime. And it doesn't talk about some of the performance issues we've already discussed, and all these other things that are actually, frankly, so bad that it's almost laughable. And further on the performance side, a lot of this is happening because Ubisoft is, in terms of the low frame rate, is happening because Ubisoft is abusing or misusing the page file. I didn't investigate this too heavily, but if you disallow page file usage in Watch Dogs using Steam's properties, and you're on a hard drive, not an SSD, I saw almost no difference on an SSD, then disabling page file usage will finally utilize a bit more of the RAM, because for some reason the game does not natively go above about 1.9 gigabytes utilization, which is kind of unbelievable given the era we live in. That's actually less RAM usage than Titanfall, which is arguably not as good looking and does not require as much RAM as a game like Watch Dogs would. So they're hitting the page file pretty heavily, they're hitting storage pretty heavily, and potentially without reason, because we've got all this very high-speed RAM going untouched. And that, again, tells me that we've got optimization issues when porting to PC from consoles, even given modern console architecture largely mirroring PCs, being x86 in both incidents. But now we can talk about fundamental design issues and move along from me doing a QA job for free. Talking about design, I've complained about hand-holding in the past, where a game tells you how to play it. I find that insulting as a player and off-putting, and just really quite unnecessary. I mean, we used to play arcade games that had no hand-holding at all, and you figure it out after a couple quarters. That's because people have some reasonable level of human intelligence that should be expected. So I've complained about this regularly. Watch Dogs doesn't necessarily do a lot of hand-holding, but it does have a lot of restrictions, and we'll go into that in a second. First, I want to point out that Watch Dogs does a few things very well. It's got a fairly compelling story, not necessarily unique, but unique within the world of gaming. It's a story that we've explored in books, in movies, but haven't gotten into in an environment where we can play as the main character. And that is fairly compelling. It actually does have a bit of emotional pull as a player. The game further has strong central characters with very visible flaws, which is always a good thing. The backdrop as a sort of cyberpunk dystopian society, or one that is on the precipice thereof, is very interesting and fun to think about. The multiplayer drop-in, drop-out gameplay as a concept is very good when the UPlay servers are functional. But all of these things are obstructed by Watch Dogs itself. Watch Dogs, in effect, is getting in its own way. It is it is both interesting and awful at the same time, and is almost like Schrodinger's cat. It is Schrodinger's watchdog. It is both a good and bad game simultaneously, and that's because we can't enjoy the good parts of it because of the bad parts of it. So starting with my hatred of the save system, as I wrote in the full review linked below, the game uses only autosaving, 100% autosaves. You are not allowed to manually save because clearly as a player you are not qualified to make the decision of when you should be saving your content. And so the game only autosaves when you're completing missions or when you reach a major milestone in some kind of main quest. It doesn't really autosave almost ever during a side mission, which is problematic. And this is problematic for a few reasons. First of all, just looking at all the things I've already enumerated in terms of bugs, if we crash during a mission, especially one that I've taken 30 minutes to try and figure out or execute in a particular way that impacts my reputation within the game in a particular way, and it crashes, I've now lost 30 minutes. And that's assuming it doesn't crash during a write and corrupt my save file, which has happened before, by the way. Because of this auto-saving, you're constantly losing data during crashes. If I could manually save or quick save, as I do in Skyrim every 30 seconds out of habit because of its crashing issues with all the mods I've installed, that is my fault, by the way, then this would not be an issue. But alas, they don't let us do manual saving, and so we sacrifice data constantly during crashes. Now, maybe your game doesn't crash so much, so what's the issue then outside of this? Well, outside of this, removing saving as a function, as a manual function from the player, suddenly takes away a huge part of an open world game, and Watch Dogs is an open world game. And the huge part it takes away is simply the fact that you should never tell a player how to play within your open world you've provided them. You can be open world or you can be railroaded. You can't be somewhere in the middle where you're telling them to go down the road, but also giving them the tantalizing glimpse of the entire world surrounding them without letting them have their way with it. And this comes from me speaking as a veteran DM of tabletop RPGs, so that's kind of my viewpoint of it. And the issue here is, let's take Morrowind. Back when Morrowind was the game to be played, I'd often end a play session by going on some sort of silly rampage or whatever out of boredom, just to create a challenge for myself. You can't do that here, because if you do, you're doing it on your only file for the character unless you copy paste and make backups. Now you're potentially changing how your character is perceived within game, so you can't have a splitting reality for your character, one with being more anarchistic and one with being more of a citizen. And that removes a bit of the fun. It also makes it impossible to explore different storylines or different pathways depending on how you execute things, because once again you can't manually save. Once it auto-saves, it overwrites whatever you had before, and it generally just makes things extremely annoying. But all of that is a shadow in comparison to the input and controls on PC. And this is where we start having issues of user abandonment of the game. The game, as I've explained in previous videos, has mouse acceleration and mouse smoothing, and both, or acceleration rather, impacts both negatively and positively. And what these things do, and they exist in Skyrim as well, is they produce a very strange, unintuitive movement of the cursor across the screen. Mouse smoothing attempts to smooth, I don't want to say smooth the pixels because that's not really a correct term, but it's, if you think of it that way, it comes from the days of mice that had the mouse ball, when you would sometimes get sort of a jump or a jitter in your movement because it would perhaps not track as many pixels per inch. So That's where mouse smoothing comes from. It's very useful with analog input devices like controllers, but it's awful with high precision mice. And we end up with something that feels like it feels like you've poured maple syrup on your mouse pad and you're attempting to move your mouse through it. It's very sluggish and lags behind almost, where your brain is telling you the crosshair or the cursor or whatever should be on the screen. Mouse acceleration is attempting to keep a more consistent speed of the mouse as you move it across the screen. So if you're moving too quickly in its mind, we'll give it a bit of anthropomorphize there, but moving too quickly and mouse acceleration will try to slow it down a bit. That's negative acceleration. Moving too slowly, it might try to speed you up to reach the other side of the screen more quickly. This is atrocious on so many levels when it comes to a game where you're trying to shoot things, because now, especially a game like Watch Dogs, where shooting them in the knees has a huge difference from shooting them in the face in terms of gameplay outcome, not just how efficiently you kill them. Because now we have trouble aiming at those particular objects, and this is furthered by the fact that there is aim assist in Watch Dogs on the PC, which is not only insulting, but detrimental to the way I want to play the game. And that's just really the start of it. So moving from there, we've got issues with mouse sensitivity and speed as a whole in different parts of the game. Watch Dogs is a game that has various menu and UI elements that change depending on what you're doing. The main menu, before you start the game, has an insanely fast mouse movement speed, which can be cured easily by decreasing the the DPI in your mouse or sensitivity in the options menu. But then as soon as you get in game, you realize that the mouse is incredibly slow because you've decreased its speed from the menu, and the speed between the game, the menu, the cameras you hack, and the infrastructure that you hack, and the smartphone and driving all feels terribly different. And although the speed doesn't actually change from being in the game to driving, it doesn't execute the same way, and this is in part because of acceleration and smoothing, but that's sort of it feels different, and that's all that matters as a player. It is actually different on an objective level between the menu, the camera, and in-game movement. So if I hack a camera, I've got to violently move the mouse to get the same amount of movement I would get with a half-inch pull of the mouse in the menu. And if I'm trying to shoot someone in the game, I've got to move the mouse a different amount than when I'm hacking the camera. So that's sort of where I'm coming from there, and that's really obnoxious on many levels as a gamer, to the point where it chases me away and makes me want to play something that makes more mechanical sense, like Counter-Strike, where I know exactly and precisely how the mouse is going to move every time I pull the mouse. It's not ever changing. And the sad thing with all this stuff is it doesn't even get into the times that input completely stops working, like when enter no longer functions as a key within the game, requiring you to restart the game completely or avoid using enter, which is pretty hard to do in Watch Dogs since it has horrible design to begin with in terms of controls for PC. And other than that, I have issues minimizing. I have to Control Alt Delete to minimize, and then when it comes back up, it's in windowed mode, so you have to Alt Enter to resume in full screen. And the best part, I think, is when Alt gets stuck down for no apparent reason, so you jump into a car and just hear the horn for 5 minutes because that's what triggers it. So moving on from that, we've still got gameplay to discuss, and this is where I take the quote from my article and say, don't give me an open world and then tell me how to play in that world. That's just, it's not even, it's just teasing the player at that point. And I say this because, first of all, gameplay is a bit repetitious, which is kind of normal for open worlds, but it's basically go here, hack this, kill that, or disable that. And that's okay, but what's not okay is the upsetting rules they've placed within the missions that are in the game, whether those are main missions or not. So as an example, we have something called mission zones. These are these are like actual circles on the minimap around your character where you must execute the mission. And if you exit that zone, it'll tell you, hey, you're exiting the zone. You have 10 seconds to get back in there, or you forfeit the mission. So okay, this I want to stem 2 topics off of this. The first is just that the mission zones are very restrictive feeling, And the problem is they don't necessarily expand as you expand your conflict with the enemy. So if I'm outrunning an enemy because I need to reposition myself, and I start exiting that zone and say the enemy is right behind me, the zone doesn't expand just because the enemy is right behind me. I have to now turn around, do a U-turn, turn around, go back in there, and I can't reposition in the way I want to, which is horrible for gameplay, because I don't need to tell you why if you're all gamers. You know why that sucks. It's very annoying, and it sort of kills the immersion. Outside of mission zones, we've got issues of mission failure. So when a mission is failed and you're still alive, meaning you didn't die and trigger a failure, maybe because you've exited the zone or something, when the mission is failed, it'll actually reload you at the beginning of the mission, reload the last autosave, so you lose all your progress. And that progress may contain things like a vehicle that you've jacked, and you maybe decide you'd rather keep that and continue playing without completing the mission, or maybe it contains something like simple map positioning. You've reached an area that you'd like to stay in. And so what should happen here is if you fail the mission, this is similar maybe to Just Cause, if you fail the mission, it should simply fail the mission and let you keep playing in your open world and let the bad guys go do whatever they were going to do before inevitably despawning or being killed or whatever. Instead, it just reloads you at the start of it, which tampers with how the player potentially wants to play your open world game you've created. Then we've got an option in the game to abort or abandon a mission, and if you choose that, it does the same thing. It'll reload you at some nearby spawn or autosave, and you once again lose anything you've accumulated during that mission insofar as map positioning and vehicles and things like that. And that's just the start of the gameplay issues. I think no matter what, whether you agree with me or not on the gameplay, there's really very little room for argument on the objective hardware performance data and the optimization, which are outright terrible, and I sincerely doubt will ever be resolved to any reasonable extent. It's just too far along, and they already delayed the game several months and couldn't do it then. They're not going to do it now. They're going to keep making DLC and pushing more content at you for you to purchase. So what does this tell us? It tells us that these game development studios and publishers really need to learn from Watch Dogs. They really need to learn from Battlefield 4. They need to learn from Titanfall's abuse of its PC players, and I've written articles about that if you're not sure what I'm talking about. And overall, we need to be more careful of hype. This is something that's been touched on for as long as the game industry's been around. And just, I wish Watch Dogs didn't have such lazy game design, because I really want to enjoy the story. But it is what it is. I would strongly urge all PC gamers to avoid this title. Save yourself the $60. I bought this game out of pocket. Normally we try to get review samples, but we could not get one in time for this one, so I bought it myself, did all the benchmarking, and I'm now doing this review. I would say avoid it. Go buy something that's actually good, something that respects your $50 or $100 mouse that's got high precision, something that respects your ability to aim as a player, and something that respects your ability to make decisions as a human. And that's all I've got to say about Watch Dogs. Full article linked in the description below. Please subscribe if you found this interesting, and I will see you all next time. Peace.